Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Russ Harrison, Director of Government Relations with IEEE-USA in Washington, D.C. This is our March 5th, 2021 legislative update. Lots of things to go over today. Before we start, it was pointed out to me by a participant in these updates that I have been politely poking fun at members of Congress for failing to update the pictures of themselves, their official photos on the internet and on their websites. And my picture that we use to publicize these updates is also not updated. So, oops, we'll work on that. But into the update. First of all, note today is the 251st anniversary of the Boston Massacre. And before you have one of the most successful pieces of political propaganda in American history. That is a picture that appeared in newspapers all over the colonies after the massacre. It was actually drawn by Paul Revere, I believe. And everything in the picture is wrong. You can see clearly the British are receiving an order to fire, which apparently didn't happen. The crowd is madly trying to get away, which was not actually what they were doing. And it's clear. You can see the moon in the sky, so everybody should be able to see what was going on clearly. It was, in fact, in the middle of a snowstorm. So almost everything that is being shown here was wrong, but it was very successful in convincing people that the Boston Massacre was yet another atrocity, the result of which led eventually to the American Revolution. So the Senate has got itself organized. Last week, we got notified who the new subcommittee chairs will be. And I'm not going to go through all of them because there were a lot of subcommittees that we're interested in, but I'll just touch on a few. The Immigration, Citizenship, and Border Security Subcommittee within the Senate Judiciary Committee. The chair will be Alex Padilla, which is a bit of a surprise. Alex Padilla is actually the most freshman member of the United States Senate. He is a Democrat from California. He took over for Vice President Harris when she resigned to become vice president, but that didn't happen until January. And so he was actually sworn in several weeks after everybody else, making him the most junior member of the United States Senate. And this is a power committee. And so it's kind of a surprise that he was given the chair. But he was. Ranking minority is, as expected, John Cornyn from Texas. The Space and Science Subcommittee of the Science Committee, we have two freshmen, well, sort of. Senator Hickenlooper, chairman, is the freshman from Colorado, but he's a very veteran politician. He was the governor of Colorado before becoming senator. And Cynthia Loomis from Wyoming, who was in the House before going to the Senate. So these are veteran politicians, veteran Washington hands, even though they're both freshmen in the Senate. And another note on pictures, I want to make it clear. Whenever I put up pictures of legislators, I try to use their official photos from their official congressional website. And I do that so nobody criticizes me from using a picture that is or isn't flattering. Mr. Hickenlooper, Senator Hickenlooper, that's his official photograph. So I didn't pick one of him without his suit on. This is what he picked. So we'll keep using it. The Water and Power Subcommittee of the Energy Committee, which is significant for those of us who care about energy, power, transmission, and distribution. Senator Ron Wyden from Oregon, veteran legislator, and someone who's deeply concerned about these issues. And Cindy Hyde-Smith, who is technically not a freshman. She is a Republican from Mississippi. She was appointed in 2018. So this is her first full term as senator, but she served before that as an appointee. And IEEE-USA looks forward to working with all these folks. Big news last week for us was President Biden's executive order on global supply chains. The president ordered his assistant for national security and his assistant for economic policy, two different people, to conduct a 100-day review into the supply chain vulnerabilities of a series of industries and segments of the economy. Excuse me. Starting with semiconductors, high-capacity batteries, critical minerals, and strategic materials, and then pharmaceuticals. The president also ordered a one-year review into the defense industrial base, information and communication technology, and public health and biological preparedness industrial base. So all of these investigations are going to look at whether the United States is vulnerable to supply disruptions, deliberate or otherwise, in the global supply chain. In each case, significant pieces of the supply chain are outside of the United States, and the president has asked essentially, should it be U.S. policy to bring those supply chains back into the country? Pardon me. We can determine something about the president's thinking, I think, by looking at how the president broke up these two assignments. 100 days to review the vulnerability of supply chains in 4 broad areas of the economy. That can't be done. Not really. Particularly when you remember that a lot of the pieces, particularly the individuals that would need to conduct that review, are not in place yet. The cabinet secretaries may or may not have been confirmed by the Senate, but the undersecretaries, the deputy secretaries, all the folks underneath the secretary who won't be put in place until there is a secretary aren't there yet. And thus, trying to do a 100-day review in the best of circumstances is unlikely, but trying to do one now when not all the pieces are in place is next to impossible. What that tells us, though, is that President Biden already knows what he wants to do in these areas. He already knows that there's vulnerabilities in semiconductors, batteries, critical minerals, and pharmaceuticals, and his team is already starting to think about what they're going to do about it. They actually probably already have a plan, at least a rough one. But they're going through the motions to have this report that will give them the justification, political and legal justification, for doing whatever comes next, probably political rather than legal. In other words, they'll use the study to justify legislation, regulations, further executive orders to pull the supply chain back into the United States. Not quite sure what that is yet, although it probably will include a bill like the Chips or Foundries Act that we supported last year. On the other hand, defense industrial base, the information and communications technology, and public health and biological preparedness, it appears the Biden administration does not know what they want to do in those areas. Thus, the one-year review, which is sufficient time to do a decent review, giving the new Biden administration time to think about it, time to talk to people, time to kind of throw some ideas around with the various agencies before the report comes out, which will then lead to action. And so what this tells us is that the president is already thinking at a very high level, it's probably the president himself, frankly, about global supply chains and their vulnerabilities. And they probably are already starting to put together a plan for pulling the supply chains back into the country, which from IEEE-USA's perspective is probably going to be a good thing. Update on infrastructure. We got a couple more hints about President Biden's thinking on infrastructure. And the suggestion is that after the COVID bill, which should be voted on today, and if not today, tomorrow, after that's done, the president intends to rotate to infrastructure. Now, as I've said before, we've heard this many times in the past, so we'll have to see. But there is, in fact, broad consensus in Washington that a big bill is necessary to increase investments in highways, bridges, and broadband. Highway and bridges and other kind of physical infrastructure assets. But broadband is always included in there, and particularly rural broadband. And in fact, the committee that would hear this particular infrastructure bill is chaired and led by legislators from rural America, who are also very concerned about broadband in their district. So we think we're in good shape there. There is deep divisions everywhere beyond kind of the core issues in an infrastructure bill. And these divisions are what derailed the last couple infrastructure bills. So the fact that there's broad consensus in a lot of important areas does not necessarily mean the bill is going to pass. Certainly doesn't mean it will be easy to pass. A couple of things have happened in the last month that have helped IEEE-USA's case for expanding the definition of infrastructure to include cyber infrastructure and power and energy. There have been 3 hacks, cyber attacks, Not necessarily that happened the last couple of weeks, that have been come out in the last couple of weeks. There was an attack in Mumbai that took out their electrical grid for an extended period of time, which the Indian government is now linking to China. There was a very bizarre hack of a water treatment facility in Tampa, technically Oldsmar, Florida, which is just north and east of Tampa. Somebody got access to the water treatment plant's control systems and instructed the system to dump a huge amount of chemicals into the city water supply, which could have caused, well, it could have killed people. Now, there were redundancies in the system that prevented that from happening, but someone did get control of the system. Actually, one of the operators actually watched the little mouse cursor move across the screen and start clicking on buttons. It was kind of an amateurish hack, but that's actually kind of even more terrifying. The fact that someone who really didn't know what they were doing did this indicates that it doesn't take very much to do this. Lastly, just came out yesterday, a cybersecurity firm has identified possibly a hack of Microsoft's email systems, that a hacker was using Microsoft email to get access to company systems and company servers. So what does this all tell us? It is just reminding Congress of the importance of our cyber infrastructure, how much damage can be done when we don't, and currently we're not, secure our infrastructure, and reminds Congress of the need to make investments to fix these vulnerabilities. We talked last time about the winter storm that harmed, in particular, Texas, with power outages, water outages for an extended period of time. There are still water problems apparently in Mississippi. A lot of pipes broke because they weren't really designed to withstand that kind of temperature. Again, reminding Congress about the need to build a sustainable electrical grid and to make sure all of our critical infrastructure needs are redundant and protected. So this is going to be a fight for IEEE-USA, and by that I mean all IEEE members in the United States, not just your staff here in Washington, to influence that bill and to help it get passed. There is, as I said, broad consensus that this bill is needed, but that doesn't mean it's going to get done. It's going to take voters talking to legislators and saying, yes, you should do that for this bill to happen. Couple little things just to bring to your attention. Virginia has passed its data privacy law that we talked about last time. Oklahoma and Washington are moving quickly to do the same thing. A number of other states are looking at similar bills. We're going to take a deep dive into these bills next, well, in 2 weeks, the next update. But from now, just point out, all of these states are moving very similar bills, but none of them are identical. And all of these little differences make it increasingly hard for companies to operate in the United States if they're trying to do business across state lines, which on the internet, almost everybody is. And so it increases the need for a national data privacy law to standardize the laws across the states. Our new Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, had said in a press conference last week that he intends to prioritize the technological competitiveness of the United States. Now, Secretary of Commerce saying that, that's not terribly interesting, but for the Secretary of State to say that is kind of unusual. Our technological competitiveness is not traditionally a priority of our chief diplomat. But what that tells us is that the Biden administration intends to continue the Trump administration's focus on economic policy as foreign policy, and as a matter of fact, as national security policy. They see our technological competitiveness in those terms, which helps us because it's always great to have high-level government officials focusing on your problems and on your industries in positive ways. We look forward to working with Secretary Blinken to help him do exactly that. Lastly, the Arizona State House moved a bill that would allow apps to bypass Apple and Google fees. In and of itself, that's interesting, but this is just one more bill, and beyond the data privacy legislation we talked about a second ago, a number of states are starting to openly take on the big tech companies. Florida is looking at doing something. A few other states are looking, particularly social media censorship issues. And internet censorship issues in general. It's not clear what will become of any of these things. All of these state kind of commerce laws, not the data privacy laws, but the commerce laws, run into the interstate commerce clause of the Constitution very quickly. States can't regulate interstate commerce. Actually, the data privacy law might bump into that, although so far not. But what it shows you is that there's growing political interest in reining in the big tech companies, and it's starting to bubble into politics. Politicians in Arizona and in Florida and a number of other states see political advantage to taking on the big tech companies. And that's what they're doing, which means if that is true, if it is in fact politically advantageous to at least try to pass legislation reining in the big tech companies, we're certainly going to see more of it. Quick update and an important update on IEEE-USA's 2021 CVD or CVVD, our Virtual Visits Day. The good news, and I didn't update these numbers. I just got our new numbers from Kayla, who works here in the Government Relations Department. We are now up to just under 160 registrants from 39 states and 102 congressional districts. What that means is at the moment, IEEE-USA's CVD will meet with 178 members of Congress for our CVD. That's just about exactly 1/3 of Congress, which is just amazing. And certainly on behalf of all the staff and volunteer leaders with IEEE-USA, I want to thank all of our participants and so many of our members who have stepped up to participate in this year's event. Here's the problem. IEEE-USA doesn't have the staff to pull off that many meetings. Many of you knew Bernadette Concepcion, who worked with us for a very long time. She could schedule 100 meetings on her own, but I don't even think she could do 170. That's just too much logistical work. So to deal with the volume of volunteers, which again is a wonderful, wonderful problem to have, we have moved our CVVD to April 14th. Instead of March 29th, it'll now be April 14th. And we are going to, we've retained a consulting company, Soapbox Consulting, to arrange the meetings and kind of facilitate the meetings for us. They'll handle all the logistics. All you'll have to do is show up and talk to your legislators. Because we've bumped the date a couple weeks, we have also extended our registration deadline to next Friday, March 12th. If any of you would like to register, we certainly can always use more help. More is always better. You can get more information on the CVVD at IEEEUSA.org/CVD, and I hope you will all join us. We got an update from the Census Bureau a week or so ago that they have delayed until April 30th their release of the final census numbers from the 2020 census. COVID slowed them down, not too surprisingly. The problem is they're going to hand out the big top line numbers on April 30th, more or less. But the numbers needed for redistricting, congressional, state, legislative, federal, congressional districts won't be released till the end of September, which is very, very late. Particularly when you remember that Virginia and New Jersey have elections in 2021 for state legislatures. Those will use the 2010 numbers. But other states, all the other states that have elections in 2022 are going to have to really scramble to get their new district lines drawn in time for the election. In June, the Census Bureau produced an update of their numbers just to let people see what was coming. Based on those estimates, the winners, and these are looking at congressional districts, the winners from the 2020 census update will be Texas, which will pick up 3 new congressional districts, Florida, which will pick up 2, and then Arizona, Colorado, Montana, North Carolina, and Oregon, each one of which will pick up 1. Probably. These are all preliminary. More on that in a second. The losers will be California, Illinois, Michigan, Minnesota, New York, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, and West Virginia, each of which will lose at least 1 seat. Notable in there, a couple things. Montana will go from 1 congressional district to 2, while Rhode Island and West Virginia will go from 2 districts to 1. Makes redistricting fairly easy when you don't have districts. Also, it looks all but certain that California will lose one congressional district for the first time in California history. This would be one of the first times California hasn't gained a seat, and in fact is on track to lose one. There is one additional seat that has to be lost. Either Alabama or New York will probably lose that additional seat. The numbers are so close that it's hard to say. May also be Montana. Montana's kind of on the edge too. They wouldn't lose a seat. They would just fail to gain one. But when the census released its updates in April, Alabama was the last one to lose a seat, but only by 6,000 people. The June update revised those numbers so that New York was the last one to lose, in this case, 2 seats. They're guaranteed to lose 1. Now it would be a second one by 24,000 seats. So it's a very narrow margin. And we're going to have to see what the final numbers are to know where that ultimate last seat comes from. If we put all this on a map, this is what it looks like. And I forgot to highlight Oregon over here. Oregon should be green as well, probably. And ignoring Alabama and New York at the moment, New York 2nd District, you can see pretty clearly what's happening. Americans are moving out of the Northeast, particularly the upper Midwest, and moving to the South and the Southwest, with the obvious and glaring exception of California. Interesting change there. By all reasonable estimates, California should have picked up a seat or two. Instead, they're losing 1 seat, which is interesting. But that's what our new redistricting lines will look like. It's way too early to tell what effect this will have on Congress. But I will say that if these were the numbers for the Electoral College, every election going back to 1968 would have been exactly the same. It would have had no impact on the winners or losers of any congressional race going back to 1968, which is as far as I looked. On that note, our next update is on March 19th. We will have good numbers on the CVD then. I'll be able to share with you some of our talking points and our messaging that we'll be doing for CVD, and we'll be focusing more closely on the state issues, state legislation pertaining to technology, particularly the data privacy laws. A lot of the states have their legislative sessions in the spring, the early part of the year, January, February, March. So by mid-March, we should have a pretty good picture of what the states are doing and what they're likely to pass or not pass. And so we'll talk about that next time. And before I turn to questions, if you do have questions, put them in the chat box and I'll rotate to them in just a second. But I'm Russ Harrison. My phone number is 202-530-8326. My email address is r.t.harrison@ieee.org. If you have any questions about anything you see in the news, anything you think IEEE should be doing, should not be doing, or if you have any questions about anything we talked about today, you should always feel free to reach out and contact me directly. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen. And go to comments. Would different state policy laws also affect foreign companies doing business here and in perhaps inhibiting foreign investments? Yeah, that's a concern. I should say, I guess it depends what the foreign company is doing. If the foreign company wants to open, say, for example, a manufacturing facility, then no, it wouldn't affect them because it only affects companies that are in the business of collecting customer information. However, if you're running a website, if you're selling a service over the internet, doing business in the United States is going to get more expensive as each one of these states pass their laws. And I actually think Congress is not going to get serious about this until they start hearing from a lot of small and mid-sized companies saying that they simply can't do business over the internet anymore because it's getting too complicated. And I think, we already have 5 or 6 states that have these laws, California being the most important. A few more big states go. Virginia is a big state. And I think Congress is going to start feeling the heat and feel the need to step up and do something about it. Brendan Godfrey pointed out that in 2000, Texas delayed redistricting for a year. And all the states are saying, no, we're going to get our redistricting done for 2022. But it's looking like that's unlikely in a lot of cases. Remember, the legislatures have to draw the lines. Then there are inevitable lawsuits, which take a while. Some of those lawsuits will succeed, which will kick the redistricting either back to the state legislatures or the courts will do it themselves. Excuse me. All of which takes time. And if you don't get the numbers until October, it's going to take you, a month or two just to figure out what the numbers mean. And then you're going to need to take some time to draw the lines. And there's lots of, it's a political process. You got to talk to a lot of people, vet it by a lot of people, run it by the lawyers, get both chambers of the state house to vote on it. Then the governor needs to sign it in most cases. It takes time. And it is not entirely clear that some states will be able to do it, but a lot of states probably will have to punt until 2024 to use their new lines. And I think that's likely to become the case more so over time. Remember, this redistricting process, reapportionment process, is actually a very important political insight, in innovation, I should say, that our founding fathers came up with. England, of course, had elections to parliament, but England didn't do this. And so because of population shifts over the decades, you ended up with some parliamentary seats that were represented by, a couple thousand people, and some parliamentary seats that represented hundreds of thousands of people. And so this is an important process. But if it slips a couple years, it's not really that big a deal in terms of, the overall health of the economy. Now, health of the country and the health of our democracy, I should say. Now, Texas would be an interesting case, because if Texas uses the 2010 lines in 2022, where do those 3 extra congressional seats go? Do we just not fill them? I don't know. So I think Texas is going to have to do something with those 3 seats, but I'm not sure quite what that would be yet. I do not see any other questions. Again, my phone number 202-530-8326. Email address is r.t.harrison@ieee.org. I hope you are all enjoying this beginning twinkles of spring wherever it is you live. And if not, I'm sure they will start appearing shortly. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. I look forward to talking with you again on March 19th. Thank you.
My superpower is engineering. I've been a roboticist almost all my life now. I think engineering is just as creative as the arts. Engineers, we solve problems. It impacts the world. It makes a difference. Without IEEE, I don't think I would have the network that I have. Anyone can get involved with IEEE-USA at any time. There's an immense amount of value for anyone at any career stage.